I always thought owning a chunk of land meant you had some say in what happened to it. Apparently, my HOA didn't get that memo. Let me back up. My name's Jake, and a few years ago, I managed to snag a nice little property at the edge of suburbia. A 3-acre plot with a cozy house, a garden I could barely keep alive, and enough space to pretend I didn't have neighbors. Paradise, right? Well, it was until the HOA decided they owned me, and my land, and apparently all the air above it and the dirt beneath it. It started innocuously enough. I came home one day and found a freshly dug trench slicing through the back half of my property like someone had taken a giant chainsaw to my lawn. My first thought? Oh great, a water main broke or something. My second thought? Wait, why didn't anyone tell me? So I followed the trench, which led me to a shiny new gas line. A gas line, on my property, that I didn't authorize. At first, I figured this was some mix-up. Mistakes happen, right? Maybe someone got the address wrong. So I called the gas company, expecting an apology and a crew to come out and fix their error. What I got instead was the customer service rep politely informing me that this installation was approved by the Homeowners Association. Excuse me? To make sure I hadn't slipped into some parallel universe where HOAs had actual authority over private land, I grabbed my deed and scoured it. Nope, my property. No easements. No permissions. Nothing. Just me, my land, and a trench full of audacity. So, like any reasonable person faced with someone playing SimCity on their property, I went to the next HOA meeting. I figured I'd calmly explain the issue, they'd realize their mistake, and we'd all move on. Spoiler alert, that's not how this story goes. The meeting was held in the neighborhood clubhouse, a sterile little room that smelled like old coffee and bad decisions. Sitting at the head of the table was our esteemed HOA president, Karen, and yes, that's her real name. If you've ever encountered a Karen in the wild, you already know the vibe. A perfectly manicured bob, a clipboard practically glued to her hand, and the smug confidence of someone who's never been told no. When it was my turn to speak, I explained the situation. I even brought pictures of the trench and the gas line, just in case they forgot their own handiwork. Karen listened, nodding like a benevolent queen hearing the peasants' woes. When I finished, she smiled and said, "Well, Jake, the HOA board approved the installation for the benefit of the community." I blinked. "You mean the community that doesn't own my land?" She tilted her head, clearly annoyed that I wasn't groveling. "As a member of this neighborhood, you agreed to abide by the HOA's decisions. Pretty sure I didn't agree to let you play pipeline tycoon in my backyard." I shot back. Her smile tightened. "The gas line will improve property values for everyone, including you. Besides, the board has already finalized the project. So you decided you could dig up my yard without even asking me?" She shrugged. "The HOA's charter gives us authority to make improvements for the common good." "Yeah, I'm gonna need to see where it says that," I said, crossing my arms. That's when things got interesting. Karen's smile disappeared, and her tone shifted from patronizing to icy. "Jake, I suggest you drop this matter. The HOA has already invested significant funds into this project. Interfering could have legal consequences." Legal consequences. Oh, now it was personal. I left the meeting with a head full of steam and a notebook full of ideas. If the HOA wanted a fight, they'd picked the wrong guy. I wasn't about to let them walk all over me or my land without a fight. The first thing I did was call a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, a real estate attorney who specialized in property rights. After hearing my story, she laughed and said, "They're bluffing. They can't do this." "That's what I thought," I said. "So what do we do?" "First, we document everything. Pictures, correspondence, meeting notes, anything that shows they've overstepped their authority. Then we'll hit them where it hurts. Legally, game on." But just as I started gathering evidence, the HOA escalated. I woke up one morning to find a letter taped to my front door. It was a formal notice. Cease and desist any actions that obstruct HOA-approved projects or face legal action. Obstruct? I hadn't touched their precious gas line. Yet, this wasn't just a case of overreach anymore. It was a full-blown power trip. And if they wanted a war, I was more than ready to give them one. Little did Karen know, She'd just made the biggest mistake of her clipboard-wielding career. You'd think an HOA threatening legal action would give me pause. But honestly, it just made me laugh. A cease and desist for not interfering with their illegal gas line? That was some next-level Karen logic. But I wasn't laughing long. Turns out the HOA wasn't content with just threats. They had more tricks up their pastel sweater sleeves. The day after I got their warning letter, I came home to find a bright orange stake in my yard. Attached to it was a laminated sign that read, Future Community Improvement Site. No trespassing. The nerve. They weren't just ignoring my objections, they were doubling down, treating my private property like it was theirs. I pulled up the stake, tossed it in my garage, and made a mental note to add trespassing to my growing list of grievances. It was time to take action. First, I set up cameras around my property. If they were bold enough to dig up my yard without permission, who knew what they'd try next? Second, I filed a police report. Not because I thought the cops would storm into the HOA office like a SWAT team, but because I wanted a paper trail. If this turned into a legal battle, every little detail would matter. While I was doing all this, my lawyer, Lisa, was working her magic. She'd sent a strongly worded letter to the HOA demanding they cease all activities on my property and provide documentation proving they had any legal right to dig there. Unsurprisingly, Karen and her cronies didn't respond. Instead, they escalated. A week later, I got a second letter, this one stamped with urgent in big, red letters. It was from the HOA's attorney, or so they claimed. The letter accused me of obstructing critical infrastructure improvements and stated that I'd be held liable for any delays or additional costs. They even threw in a veiled threat about financial damages. Cute. Really cute. I forwarded the letter to Lisa, who called me within minutes. Jake, this is complete nonsense, she said, her voice a mix of amusement and irritation. They're bluffing, but it's a bold bluff. Let's make them regret it. Lisa's next move was genius. She filed a formal complaint with the county's zoning and planning office. If the HOA thought they could dig up my land without proper permits, they were about to get a rude awakening. The county took these things seriously, and Lisa made sure to highlight every violation. Unauthorized construction, trespassing, and failure to notify the property owner. Meanwhile, I decided to rally the troops. I started talking to my neighbors, casually bringing up the gas line fiasco and gauging their reactions. Most of them were shocked. Turns out, Karen hadn't exactly been transparent about the project. She'd spun it as a much-needed upgrade that would benefit the whole neighborhood, conveniently leaving out the part where it trampled all over my property rights. One neighbor, a retired engineer named Bill, was particularly interested. He had a long history of butting heads with the HOA and wasn't shy about sharing his disdain. They're all a bunch of amateurs, he said, shaking his head. They think a clipboard makes them experts. If you need help, let me know. Bill turned out to be a goldmine of information. He'd kept meticulous records of every HOA project for the past decade, and his notes painted a pretty damning picture. Financial irregularities, shady contracts, and a pattern of ignoring residents' concerns. The gas line wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of overreach and mismanagement. Armed with Bill's records, Lisa's legal expertise, and my growing file of evidence, I felt more prepared than ever. But then, just as I was starting to feel like I had the upper hand, the HOA played their next card. They filed a lawsuit against me. The suit claimed I was interfering with an HOA-approved project and sought an injunction to prevent me from hindering their work. The audacity was almost impressive. They had trespassed, dug up my land, and ignored every attempt to resolve the issue, and now they were suing me? Lisa wasn't surprised. This is classic intimidation, she said. They think they can scare you into backing down, but they're overplaying their hand. Let's hit them where it hurts. And that's exactly what we did. Our first move was to file a countersuit. Lisa drafted a blistering complaint accusing the HOA of trespassing, property damage, and abuse of power. We also sought an injunction to stop any further work on the gas line until the matter was resolved in court. If the HOA wanted a legal battle, they were about to get one. But that wasn't all. Lisa suggested a strategy that was equal parts clever and diabolical. We'd go public. HOAs hate bad press, she explained. If we make this a public issue, they'll have a lot more to worry about than just you. So I reached out to a local news station. The reporter I spoke to was immediately interested. This sounds like a classic HOA horror story, she said. We'd love to cover it. Within days, a news crew was standing in my yard, filming the trench and interviewing me about the HOA's antics. I made sure to emphasize the overreach, the lack of transparency, and the impact on the community. By the time the segment aired, the story had gone viral. Suddenly, my little gas line debacle was the talk of the town. The HOA's response was predictable. They doubled down. Karen released a statement calling my actions selfish and accusing me of undermining the community's best interests, but her words rang hollow. Thanks to Bill's records and Lisa's legal expertise, we were building a case that would expose the HOA for what they really were, a bunch of power-hungry bullies. And as the pressure mounted, it became clear that Karen and her clipboard army were starting to crack. If you told me a few months ago that I'd be starring in a local news story about an HOA overstepping its bounds, I'd have laughed. But here I was, watching my face on the evening news while Karen's statement scrolled across the bottom of the screen like some sad attempt at damage control. The backlash hit harder than even I expected. My phone buzzed nonstop with messages from neighbors offering support, or in some cases, gleefully sharing their own horror stories about Karen and her clipboard mafia. But for all the schadenfreude, I knew this was just the beginning. The HOA wasn't going to roll over, not with Karen's ego on the line. And sure enough, they fired back with a motion to expedite their lawsuit. Lisa assured me this was another intimidation tactic, but it was clear they were trying to put me on the defensive. Too bad for them, I'd already moved to offense. With the countersuit in motion and the community buzzing about the HOA's antics, Lisa and I decided it was time to turn up the heat. We started with Bill's treasure trove of records. His meticulous notes were a goldmine of questionable HOA activities. Misappropriated funds, undisclosed contracts, and projects that mysteriously benefited board members more than the community. It was all there in black and white. One entry caught my eye, a landscaping contract from 2 years ago. The HOA had hired a company run by Karen's cousin, a fact conveniently omitted from the official meeting minutes. The contract was for a beautification project that somehow cost double the market rate and involved replanting bushes that were already there. This is a smoking gun, Lisa said when I showed her the record. It establishes a pattern of self-dealing. If we can prove this, it'll undermine their entire case. Next, we dug into the permits or lack thereof for the gas line. As expected, the HOA had cut corners. There was no record of them applying for the necessary approvals from the county. Instead, they'd filed something called a notice of intent, which was basically their way of saying, "We'll deal with the paperwork later." Classic Karen. Armed with this evidence, Lisa filed another motion to dismiss their lawsuit on the grounds that the project itself was illegal. But we didn't stop there. Remember that news segment? It turned out to be the gift that kept on giving. A local watchdog group got wind of the story and started digging into the HOA's finances. Within days, they'd uncovered discrepancies that even Bill hadn't spotted. For instance, the HOA's annual budget included a suspiciously high line item for administrative costs, a chunk of which went to consulting fees. The consultant, Karen's personal friend, who had no verifiable experience in HOA management but did run a business solutions company out of her garage. The watchdog group published their findings online, and the story exploded. Comments poured in from people who dealt with similar HOA nightmares. The phrase "Karen's gasline" became a local meme, and someone even made a parody Twitter account pretending to be the gas line itself. Karen wasn't amused. At the next HOA meeting, she called for an emergency vote to approve additional legal funds to defend the HOA's integrity. It didn't go as planned. A sizable chunk of the neighborhood had shown up, including Bill, myself, and several others who'd grown tired of Karen's antics. When she brought the motion to the floor, I raised my hand. "Point of order," I said, standing up. "Before we approve more legal funds, can we get a breakdown of how the current funds are being spent? Specifically, How much of it is going toward defending illegal projects like the gas line? The room erupted in murmurs. Karen's face turned redder than a stop sign. That information is confidential, she snapped. Actually, it's not, Lisa chimed in. She'd come along as my guest, armed with copies of the HOA's bylaws and a thorough understanding of the law. As dues-paying members, homeowners have the right to review financial records. Unless, of course, there's something you're trying to hide. Karen tried to regain control, but the damage was done. The motion failed, and the meeting devolved into chaos as neighbors started demanding answers. I left that night feeling more optimistic than I had in weeks. The tide was turning, but the fight was far from over. Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly, and I knew she'd try to claw her way out of the mess she'd made. The question was, how far was she willing to go? Karen might have hoped the chaos from the last meeting would die down, but she underestimated the power of an angry neighborhood and a determined homeowner with a lawyer like Lisa. While Karen scrambled to patch the cracks in her precious HOA, I doubled down on gathering evidence, and what we uncovered next was enough to make even seasoned cynics raise an eyebrow. Lisa and I pored over the HOA's financial records, which we finally obtained after filing a formal request under the bylaws. To say the books were shady would be an understatement. In addition to the consulting fees funneled to Karen's friend, there were expenses for things that didn't exist, like a security upgrade that supposedly cost $10,000 but amounted to a single rusted camera mounted on a pole near the clubhouse. Even better, Bill discovered that the HOA's reserve fund, money meant for emergencies, had been mysteriously drained over the past 2 years. Most of it had gone to administrative costs, a black hole that seemed to swallow thousands of dollars with no explanation. When we cross-referenced these withdrawals with Karen's projects, the timeline lined up a little too perfectly. Meanwhile, the community was growing restless. The news story and watchdog group's report had stirred the pot, and more neighbors were coming forward with their own complaints. A few even claimed Karen had pressured them into silence about past issues, threatening fines or other retaliatory measures. One woman, Sandra, told me Karen had tried to charge her $500 for painting her mailbox the wrong shade of beige. It was clear that Karen had spent years running the HOA like her own little fiefdom, and now her reign was unraveling. But the real kicker came when Lisa discovered a crucial piece of evidence buried in the county's public records: the gas line contract. Turns out, the HOA's deal with the gas company wasn't just shady, it was outright illegal. Karen had signed the contract without proper authorization from the board or the community. Worse, she'd included a clause indemnifying the HOA and herself from liability, effectively shifting all the risk onto the homeowners. If anything went wrong with the gas line, it would be the residents footing the bill. "This is it," Lisa said, holding up the document like it was the Holy Grail. "This proves she's been acting outside her authority. We've got her." Armed with this bombshell, we prepared for the next HOA meeting, which was shaping up to be a showdown of epic proportions. Word had spread about the financial irregularities and the gas line contract, and the clubhouse was packed to capacity. People who'd never bothered attending a meeting before were now lining the walls, eager to see Karen squirm. When the meeting began, Karen looked visibly rattled. Gone was her usual smug confidence. Instead, she fumbled through the agenda, clearly hoping to avoid addressing the elephant in the room. But Lisa and I weren't about to let her off the hook. When it came time for open discussion, I stood up. "I have a few questions about the gas line project," I said, holding up a copy of the contract. Specifically, how it was approved without board or community input. Karen's face went pale. "That's a private matter," she stammered. "The board has the authority to make decisions on behalf of the community." "Actually, you don't," Lisa interjected, standing beside me. She held up the HOA's bylaws, flipping to the relevant section. "Major projects like this require a community vote. And even if they didn't, you've been using funds and signing contracts without proper authorization. That's a violation of both HOA rules and state law." The room erupted. Neighbors started shouting questions and demands, their frustration boiling over. Karen tried to gavel the room into silence, but it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a pool noodle. "We demand an audit," someone yelled. Resign, shouted another. Karen's vice president, a nervous-looking man named Tom, finally spoke up. Maybe we should address these concerns, he said, glancing nervously at Karen. There's nothing to address, Karen snapped, but it was too late. The momentum had shifted, and the room wasn't buying her excuses anymore. By the end of the meeting, the board had agreed to an independent audit of the HOA's finances, and Karen's control was slipping. Neighbors were organizing a petition to remove her as president, and the lawsuit against me was quickly losing support. But Karen wasn't going down without a fight. She stormed out of the meeting, muttering something about lawyers and defamation. I knew she'd try to regroup, but for the first time, it felt like the community was on my side. The HOA's house of cards was teetering, and one more push might bring it all down. After the explosive HOA meeting, I expected Karen to start laying low. Maybe take a long vacation somewhere far away to let the heat die down. But Karen, being Karen, decided to double down. A few days later, every homeowner in the neighborhood got a letter in the mail, an official-looking document on HOA letterhead with her signature at the bottom. The letter was pure propaganda. It accused me and Lisa of spreading misinformation and destabilizing the community. She claimed the gas line project was vital infrastructure and that our actions were delaying progress and driving up costs. She even implied that anyone opposing her was putting the neighborhood's safety at risk. The cherry on top, a thinly veiled threat that further disruptions would result in substantial fines. Oh, Karen. Sweet, delusional Karen. Rather than intimidate the neighborhood, her letter backfired spectacularly. My phone blew up with calls and texts from neighbors who were furious about her scare tactics. Even some of her staunchest supporters were starting to question her leadership. People who'd been on the fence about the gas line were now squarely in my camp, if only because they were tired of Karen's antics. That's when I realized Karen wasn't just losing control of the HOA. She was losing the neighborhood, and I was going to make sure she didn't get it back. So I moved on to building a coalition. My first step was organizing a meeting of my own. I rented out a room at the local library and invited every homeowner who'd expressed concerns about the gas line or the HOA's leadership. I called it a community discussion forum to keep things neutral, but let's be honest. It was a rally. To my surprise, the turnout was huge. Over 50 people showed up, many of them clutching copies of Karen's letter like it was a subpoena. Bill brought a stack of his infamous records, and Lisa came armed with printouts of the gas line contract and the financial irregularities we'd uncovered. I started the meeting by laying out the facts. The unauthorized gas line, the misuse of HOA funds, and Karen's pattern of overreach. Lisa explained the legal implications, emphasizing how Karen's actions had put the community at risk. Then Bill took the floor, delivering a detailed history of the HOA's mismanagement that left the room buzzing. When we opened the floor for discussion, the floodgates opened. People vented about everything from unfair fines to botched projects to Karen's condescending attitude. One woman tearfully described how Karen had fined her for putting up Christmas light a week too early. Another neighbor revealed that he'd been charged for lawn violations while he was deployed overseas. By the end of the night, we had a clear plan. Petition to remove Karen as HOA president, demand a full audit of the HOA's finances, and put the gas line project on indefinite hold. More importantly, we had momentum. The community was fired up, and Karen's support was crumbling. Of course, Karen wasn't going down without a fight. Within 48 hours of our meeting, she called an emergency board meeting, closed to the public naturally. The agenda, which she posted on the HOA's website, was vague but included ominous phrases like disciplinary actions and legal strategy. Even though we wasn't invited, but Lisa and Bill managed to get some intel from a sympathetic board member. Apparently, Karen was pushing for new rules to restore order, including restrictions on community meetings and harsher penalties for violations. She also wanted the HOA to hire a PR firm to rebuild trust, which was hilarious considering she was the one who destroyed it. Meanwhile, the petition to remove Karen was gaining steam. We needed signatures from 25% of the homeowners to force a vote, and within a week we had more than enough. The petition wasn't just about the gas line anymore. It was a referendum on Karen's leadership, and judging by the response, she was in deep trouble. The final nail in Karen's coffin came from an unexpected source: the county zoning office. Remember how Lisa had filed a complaint about the gas line's lack of permits? Well, the county had finally completed their investigation, and the results were scathing. Not only had the HOA failed to obtain the necessary permits, but the gas line itself was in violation of multiple safety codes. The county issued an immediate stop work order and slapped the HOA with hefty fines. They also announced that any future construction on the project would require approval from all affected property owners, of course including me. When the news broke, it was the talk of the neighborhood. Karen tried to spin it as a minor setback, but no one was buying it. Even her allies on the board were starting to distance themselves, realizing that sticking with her was a sinking ship. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. Karen tried to maintain control, but the crowd wasn't having it. People demanded answers, called for her resignation, and waved copies of the county's stop work order like pitchforks. Karen, visibly flustered, made one last attempt to assert her authority. "I've always acted in the best interests of this community," she declared, her voice trembling. "Then step down," someone shouted from the back. The room erupted in applause. Karen's reign was over. With the petition to remove Karen in full swing and the county's stop work order shutting down the gas line project, the tide had officially turned. Karen was clinging to her position like a cat on a sinking ship, but her grasp on power was slipping faster than she could backpedal. The decisive moment came when the petition hit the required threshold, forcing the HOA to hold a special election. I don't think Karen fully understood how bad things had gotten until the election meeting was announced. The timing couldn't have been worse for her. The local news was still following the story. The watchdog group was preparing to release a full report on the HOA's finances, and the community was buzzing with frustration and determination to see her ousted. To add fuel to the fire, Lisa and I decided to publish a detailed account of everything we'd uncovered, complete with receipts, so to speak. We called it the HOA Chronicles. Mismanagement, Manipulation, and Misplaced Gas Lines. It was a dry title, but the content was anything but. Every homeowner in the neighborhood got a copy, and the response was electric. Karen's actions were laid bare, and it wasn't a pretty picture. The special election was scheduled for a Saturday morning at the community center. I arrived early with Bill, Lisa, and a few other neighbors who had become unofficial leaders of the anti-Karen movement. By the time the meeting started, the room was packed. People were standing along the walls, and the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Karen sat at the head of the table, flanked by the remaining board members who hadn't yet jumped ship. She looked composed on the surface, but I could see the tension in her clenched jaw and the way she gripped her clipboard like it was a life raft. The process was simple. Homeowners would vote on whether to remove Karen as president, and if the majority voted yes, the board would appoint an interim leader until the next regular election. But before the vote, Karen had one last chance to make her case. She stood and addressed the room, her voice steady but strained. "I understand that some of you are frustrated," she began, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "But everything I've done has been for the benefit of this community. The gas line project, the administrative decisions. These were necessary steps to ensure the neighborhood's future." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Karen pressed on. "I know mistakes were made, but I believe we can move forward together. Stronger, united, and committed to making this community the best it can be." It was a decent speech, but the crowd wasn't buying it. When she finished, the room fell silent for a moment before someone shouted, "What about the missing funds, Karen?" Another voice chimed in. "What about the illegal contract?" Karen tried to respond, but the questions kept coming. Her calm facade cracked as she stammered out half-answers and deflections. By the time the board called for a vote, the tension in the room was palpable. The vote wasn't even close. Out of the 94 homeowners who participated, 78 voted to remove Karen. When the results were announced, the room erupted in applause and cheers. Karen sat frozen for a moment, her face a mask of disbelief. Then, without a word, she gathered her clipboard and stormed out of the room, leaving her former allies to deal with the aftermath. The board quickly moved to appoint an interim president, Bill, to no one's surprise. The crowd gave him a standing ovation as he took the floor and promised a new era of transparency and accountability for the HOA. With Karen officially out, the floodgates opened. The watchdog group released their full report, which revealed even more financial misconduct, including personal reimbursements Karen had claimed under the guise of community development. The county announced an additional investigation into the HOA's operations, and several residents began organizing a class action lawsuit to recover the misused funds. As for the gas line, the county's stop work order remained in place, and Bill worked with Lisa to draft a proposal to scrap the project entirely. It passed with overwhelming support at the next HOA meeting. The gas company wasn't thrilled, but with the contract voided due to lack of proper authorization, there wasn't much they could do. And Karen? She didn't go quietly. Rumor had it she tried to sue the HOA for wrongful removal, but the case was thrown out almost immediately. Last I heard, she sold her house and moved to another neighborhood, presumably one where the HOA didn't already know her reputation. With Karen gone and the gas line project dead, the neighborhood began to heal. Bill proved to be a fantastic interim president, bringing a level of professionalism and transparency that the HOA sorely needed. He spearheaded a full audit, implemented stricter financial oversight, and even lowered HOA dues by cutting unnecessary expenses. As for me, I finally got my yard back and my peace of mind. It had been a long, exhausting battle, but it was worth it. The HOA learned that they couldn't steamroll over homeowners, and the community learned the importance of holding leaders accountable. Every so often, I think back to that first day when I found the gas line trench in my yard. It's funny how something so small can spiral into such a massive ordeal. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: never underestimate the power of a clipboard-wielding Karen or a determined homeowner with a lawyer and a grudge.